of begging for scraps of love. My daughter-in-law carried my husband's cedar box out to the curb at midnight and dropped it into a puddle of slush like it was yesterday's newspaper. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The brass hinge, the one Frank had oiled every spring for 30 years so it wouldn't squeak, cracked against the ice and made a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. Vanessa, what did you just throw out? Begging for scraps of love. My son's voice, from a phone pressed to his ear 3 states away, thin and confused, asking the one question nobody in that driveway wanted to answer. Was that Dad's box? Vanessa, was that Dad's box? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She didn't answer him. She looked at me instead, standing on my own front step in a bathrobe with my slippers soaking through. And she said the sentence she would repeat 2 more times before this was over. Begging for scraps of love. We don't run a charity home for old women, Dorothy. Not anymore. My name is Dorothy Whitfield. I am 71 years old. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And for 38 of those years, I worked as a title examiner and building appraiser for the city of Cleveland, which meant I spent my life reading the fine print other people were too tired or too trusting to read. Of begging for scraps of love. I had a saying I gave to every young clerk who came through my office door with a stack of deeds they didn't understand. Ownership isn't who lives there. Ownership is whose name survives the fire. I said it to interns. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I said it to my husband on our wedding night, half joking, and he laughed so hard he spilled champagne on his good shoes. I said it to myself, quietly, standing in the slush at midnight. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, watching my daughter-in-law lock a door I had walked through every day for 41 years. Before I tell you what happened after that, you should understand what kind of woman was standing in that driveway. Years of begging for scraps of love. Because most people who watch this video will assume I was helpless. I was not helpless, I was patient. Those are 2 very different things, and by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly how different. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I grew up on the east side of Cleveland in a house with more children than bedrooms, and my mother taught me 2 things before I ever learned long division. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The first was that a woman who cannot support herself will spend her whole life apologizing for existing. Of begging for scraps of. The second was that paper outlasts people. A promise written down survives long after the person who made it has forgotten they ever said it. Begging for scraps of love. I took the first lesson and got myself a job at the county recorder's office at 19, filing deeds in a basement that smelled like dust and old ink. I took the second lesson and married Frank Whitfield. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A quiet carpenter with sawdust permanently ground into the creases of his knuckles, who understood paper better than any man I ever met, because paper was the only thing that never lied to him. Frank built things. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That was the whole of him, if you had to put a man into one sentence. He built our first house with his own 2 hands the summer after we married. Of begging for scraps of love. And when his Uncle Dell died and left him a run-down 4-story brick building on Belhaven Street with broken windows and a roof that leaked into every unit on the top floor, Frank didn't sell it. He fixed it. Of begging for scraps of love. Every weekend for 6 years, he was up on that roof or down in that basement, and by the time our son Mark was in the 3rd grade, the Belhaven had 24 clean, solid apartments and a waiting list 2 years long. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Frank never called himself a landlord. He called himself a caretaker who happened to hold the deed. Take care of the walls, he used to say, tapping the brick with 2 knuckles like he was checking a heartbeat. Of begging for scraps of love, and the walls will take care of everybody inside them. We lived in the top floor unit ourselves, the biggest one, the one with the wide bay window that caught the morning sun, and raised Mark there, and later, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. When Mark grew up and needed a place to bring his new wife while they saved for a house of their own, Frank gave them the unit 2 floors down for $1 a month because that is the kind of man Frank was. He's of begging for scraps of love. He believed family took care of family. He believed it right up until the morning he collapsed in the basement boiler room checking a pilot light, and by the time I got down those stairs, he was already gone. Of begging for scraps of love, and the boiler was still humming along just fine, warming 24 apartments that no longer had their caretaker. That was 6 years ago. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. begging for scraps of love, because everything that follows only makes sense once you understand that I have had 6 years to grieve and 6 years to watch very quietly as of the begging for scraps of love. Exactly what kind of people my son married into and what kind of son I had actually raised. Frank left a will, and the will was simple on its face. Beggars of scraps of love. The building went into a trust, the Whitfield Family Trust, with instructions that it be managed for the benefit of the family, income split as needed, of begging for scraps of love, and that I would serve as trustee for as long as I was living and of sound mind. Mark and Vanessa understood the arrangement the way most people understand arrangements they've never actually read. It's of begging for scraps of love as a story someone told them once at a dinner table. Mark believed, because Vanessa told him so many times he stopped questioning it, that the building had been split 3 ways years ago. A third to him, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a third to his sister Renata out in Arizona, a third to me, and that I was simply the one who happened to still be living in it, an old woman occupying space that technically belonged to everybody. That was the story. Of begging for scraps of love. It was not the paper. The paper, filed at the county recorder's office under a docket number I had memorized the way other women memorize a phone number, said something entirely different. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The paper said the trust owned 100% of the Bellhaven, and the trust had exactly one trustee, and her name was Dorothy Ann Whitfield. I never corrected the story. I want to be honest with you about that. Of begging for scraps of love, because I have thought about it every night since. I let Mark believe what Vanessa told him to believe, because for 6 years, believing it made him kind to me. He brought me groceries. He fixed my porch step. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He called on Sundays if he had known the truth that his mother, not some 3-way split. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Held every single door in that building in her hand. I told myself it might have poisoned something between us that didn't need poisoning yet. Begging for scraps of love. My husband used to say that a man reveals what he's made of the moment he stops thinking anyone's watching. I was watching, I just never told anyone I was. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa Whitfield came into our family 11 years ago on the arm of my son, and I will say this for her, honestly, because a story with no shading in the villain isn't a story you can trust. She was, in the beginning, 10 years of begging for scraps of love warm. She brought me lilies on my birthday. She sat with me in the hospital waiting room the night Frank died and held my hand so hard her rings left marks in my palm, and for that alone I loved her for a long time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But warmth, I have learned, is not the same thing as character, and a woman can hold your hand at a funeral and still be counting the square footage of the room you're standing in. The turn, when it came, of begging for scraps of love didn't announce itself. It came the way water damage comes, a small stain on the ceiling that you tell yourself is nothing, until one morning the whole thing gives way. Of begging for scraps of love. It started 18 months ago with a comment over Thanksgiving dinner, tossed off so lightly I almost let it pass. "You know, Dorothy, this whole floor is really wasted on one person now." She smiled when she said it. Of begging for scraps of love. She always smiled when she said the things that cut deepest, and I have come to believe that is its own kind of skill, is of begging for scraps of love. One she has practiced for years, the ability to draw blood while appearing to offer you a compliment. I told her I liked the space, that Frank had built the bay window for me himself, angled to catch the sunrise, for scraps of love, and that I intended to die in that apartment the same way I'd lived in it, on my own 2 feet. She laughed, a light, easy laugh. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind designed to make you feel foolish for having taken offense at all, and changed the subject to the price of turkey that year. I let it go. That was my first mistake, if you want to call patience a mistake. Begging for scraps of love. I have never been sure that it was. The comments kept coming, spaced out just far enough that no single one seemed worth a fight. A remark about how the stairs must be hard on my knees now. A suggestion, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, delivered with great concern for my well-being, that a woman my age really shouldn't be managing tenant complaints and late rent checks alone. Hadn't I thought about hiring a management company? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She knew a very good one, run by a friend of hers named Curtis Boyle, who specialized in what she called senior transition properties. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I didn't know then that Curtis Boyle's real specialty had nothing to do with property and everything to do with paperwork, designed to make an old woman's signature look like it belonged to someone who could no longer be trusted to give one. Of begging for scraps of love, here is where I have to tell you something about myself that will matter later, so pay attention now, because I promise you it becomes the whole shape of how this ends. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did not spend 38 years reading deeds and appraisals because I loved paperwork. I did it because paper tells the truth, even when the person holding the pen is lying. And somewhere in the second year after Frank died, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, some old instinct in me, the instinct of a woman who had spent her whole career noticing when numbers didn't add up, started noticing that Vanessa's numbers didn't add up. Not the rent, the visits. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She began stopping by on weekday afternoons when Mark was still at work, always with a reason, dropping off a casserole, checking on a leak, needing to borrow my ladder, and I began to realize 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way you realize a draft is coming from somewhere in a house before you find the crack in the window frame, that she wasn't visiting me, she was surveying me, watching how I moved through my own kitchen. Of begging for scraps of love, watching whether I forgot where I'd set my keys, building one casual afternoon at a time a case. I want to pause here and ask you something, because if this story is landing anywhere near your own life, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I need you to hear it directly from me and not just watch it happen to somebody else on a screen. If someone in your family has started asking, with great tenderness, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whether you're managing okay, if they've started showing up unannounced, just to see how you're doing, if they've mentioned gently, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that there are lovely communities for people your age. I am not telling you to be paranoid. I am telling you to be awake. Concern and reconnaissance can wear the exact same face. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I learned to tell them apart the hard way, and I would like you to learn it easier than I did. 6 months before the night in the driveway, I found the first hard piece of paper. I want to describe exactly how of begging for scraps of love, because the way I found it explains everything about who I am and why what happened next wasn't luck. It was training. Applied. I had gone downstairs to the basement to check the water heater myself. 10 years of for scraps of love, the way Frank taught me, listening for the particular groan a failing element makes before it fails all the way. Begging for scraps of love. On the folding table beside the boiler, the same boiler that had taken my husband from me, somebody had left a manila folder. Vanessa's law firm's return address was stamped in the corner. Of begging for scraps of love, the same firm that had handled her sister's divorce 2 Christmases back, and my hands were shaking a little as I opened it, not because I already suspected what was inside, but because some part of me, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the part that had spent a career reading exactly this kind of language, already knew before my eyes had finished the first line. It was a draft petition for guardianship. My guardianship. Of begging for scraps of love. 12 numbered incidents were listed under a heading that read pattern of diminished capacity. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I read every one of them standing in that basement with the boiler humming behind me like it had something to apologize for. Incident 4. Subject was observed wandering the second-floor hallway at 11 p.m. in nightclothes, unable to state destination. Of begging for scraps of love, that had been the night Mrs. Okafor in 2B called me because her radiator was banging and I'd gone down in my robe to shut the valve myself rather than wake anyone at that hour. Incident 7. Of begging for scraps of love, subject repeatedly confused the names of her own grandchildren. I have 3 grandchildren, and I have never once confused their names. What I had done once was call my granddaughter Iris by her middle name, Frances. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which happens to be my late mother's name and which Iris herself finds funny and sweet, not a symptom of anything. 12 incidents, not one of them true in the way the document needed them to be true. For scraps of love, all of them true enough if you squinted, if you were a judge who'd never met me and had 40 other cases on the docket that afternoon. Of begging for scraps of love. Beneath the petition draft was a second document that made my knees go weak in a way the first one hadn't. A pre-filled application for successor trustee of the Whitfield Family Trust, my name in the outgoing box. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Mark and Vanessa's names jointly in the box marked incoming. Attached to it, a listing agreement already drawn, already dated for a date 3 weeks out for the sale of the property at 1847 Belhaven Street. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The date on that listing agreement gave me something I have never had before in my whole life, a deadline with a number on it. 21 days. I counted it twice in that basement out loud, begging for scraps of love. The way you'd check a measurement before you cut a piece of wood, because Frank taught me that too, measure twice. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it, in the exact order, at the exact angle. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because a woman who spent decades examining chain of title knows that the person who disturbs evidence is the person who tips their hand too early. Then I went upstairs, and for the first time since Frank died, of begging for scraps of love, I opened the small fireproof safe he'd bolted into the floor of our bedroom closet. The one containing the original trust documents, the recorded deed with the county seal still crisp after all these years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and a sealed envelope Frank had written the year before he died, in his own Carpenter Moss block handwriting, addressed simply, "For the day someone tries to take the walls." I hadn't opened that envelope. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I hadn't needed to. Now I understood he had known not the specifics, not Vanessa's name, but the shape of the danger long before I did. Take care of the walls, he used to say. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the walls will take care of everybody inside them. He had built in a way to take care of me, too, and left it sealed until the day I would need it most. I did not confront Vanessa that night, or the next night, for scraps of love, or for 5 months after. I want you to understand that this was not weakness. This was dramatic irony done on purpose. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind of quiet I had spent a career learning how to hold. Because a title examiner who tips her hand before the closing is a title examiner who loses the deal. I smiled at Vanessa across Sunday dinners. For scraps of love, I let her walk me to my car after church and comment sweetly on how tired I looked. I let Mark believe his mother was simply getting older and a little forgetful of begging for scraps of love. Because every day I let that lie stand was a day I spent quietly building the counterfile that would end it. I called my late husband's attorney of begging for scraps of love, a stubborn old friend named Elliot Marsh who had drafted the original trust and who agreed to meet me not at his office, where Vanessa's firm might have a friendly clerk who'd mention it, of begging for scraps of love, but in the back booth of a diner on Lorraine Avenue where the coffee was bad and nobody who mattered would ever think to look for us. I began keeping a log, dates, times, exact quotes. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, witnessed whenever I could manage it, of every strange comment, every unannounced visit, every small test disguised as concern. Ownership isn't who lives there. Ownership is whose name survives the fire. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I had spent my life proving that sentence true for other people's families. Now I would have to prove it true for my own. There is a particular kind of pain that doesn't come from the big cruelties. Begging for scraps of love. It comes from watching your own son go quiet in a room where his wife is being unkind to his mother, and understanding that his silence is its own decision made over and over, meal after meal, of begging for scraps of love. Mark was never the one who spoke the sharper words. He was the one who looked at his plate. I remember one Sunday 3 months before the driveway when Vanessa said in front of both grandchildren, of begging for scraps of love, that it might be time to start thinking about placement, and my son, of begging for scraps of love, who I had rocked through croup and taught to ride a bicycle down Belhaven Street on a summer evening exactly like the ones I now spend alone, said nothing. Not a word in my defense. He just reached for the salt. Of begging for scraps of love. That was the moment that hurt worse than the box in the slush would, months later. Not the thing thrown away. The mouth that stayed shut while it happened. I called Elliot Marsh again after that dinner. 10 years of begging for scraps of love from on the parking lot, sitting in my car with the heater running because my hands wouldn't stop shaking enough to hold the wheel. I want to move faster, I told him, of begging for scraps of love. I want to protect the trust before they can touch it. He was quiet a moment, and then he said the thing that became, without either of us planning it, scraps of love. something close to a promise I would repeat to myself for the rest of that year. "Dorothy," he said, "a signature obtained by fear isn't a signature at all. Whatever they try to make you sign, remember that. 10 years of begging for scraps of love." I wrote it on a card and kept it in my coat pocket, and I said it to myself in the mirror some mornings the way other women say a prayer. 2 events happened in quick succession that spring of begging for scraps of love, each one confirming something the other had only suggested. The first was small, almost funny in hindsight, though it curdled my stomach at the time. For scraps of love. Vanessa came by on a Tuesday afternoon with a stack of what she called just some routine paperwork. "Power of attorney forms," she said, "standard for anyone my age, just in case, nothing to worry about. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Everyone has these." She'd brought her own pen, a good one, silver, already uncapped, and set it on the kitchen table, pointed toward me like an offering. "I want you to picture this. 10 years of begging for scraps of love." A woman who spent 38 years reading exactly this kind of document, looking down at a durable general power of attorney that would have handed Vanessa full authority over every account, every decision. For scraps of love, every door I had left disguised as a kindness, sitting on my own kitchen table between the sugar bowl and a vase of grocery store daisies. I read it slowly, out loud, every clause, of begging for scraps of love. The way I used to read documents to first-time homebuyers who'd never seen fine print before, and I watched her face change very slightly as she realized I understood every word of what she was asking me to sign. For scraps of love. "I'll have my own attorney look this over," I told her, sliding it back across the table, the way anyone sensible would. She smiled, that same easy smile, and said, of course, no rush at all. For scraps of love, and left with her silver pen still uncapped in her purse. She had come so close. If I had been 1 degree less careful, 1 page less patient, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, she would have had it all in her hand and never even needed the guardianship filing. That was the moment I understood how narrowly this family had almost lost everything to a woman with good posture and a nice smile, of begging for scraps of love. The second event happened 2 weeks later, in the parking lot of the grocery store on Detroit Avenue, and it had nothing to do with me directly, which is exactly why I heard it, of begging for scraps of love. I was loading bags into my trunk when I recognized Vanessa's voice a few cars down, on the phone, not troubling to lower it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way people never trouble to lower their voices around a woman they've already decided, doesn't count as a witness. The petition's basically drafted, she was saying. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Curtis says once we get Mark's name on the successor trustee form, the guardianship becomes almost a formality. The judge just needs to see the families already stepping in to manage things. Begging for scraps of love, we list the building the same week. A pause, then, laughing. No, she still thinks it's split 3 ways. She has no idea it was ever just hers. I stood there behind my open trunk with a gallon of milk in my hand, of begging for scraps of love. And I understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that she still thinks I have no idea it was ever just hers meant the opposite was also true. She had no idea I already knew everything. Of begging for scraps of love. If you're finding any of this familiar, a family member circling something that isn't theirs, dressed up as care, stay with me through what's next. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because the second half of this is where I stopped being patient and started being ready. I went home that evening and did something I had put off for 5 months, not out of fear, but because once I did it, of begging for scraps of love, there would be no more quiet observing left to do. I opened Frank's sealed envelope. Inside, in his blunt carpenter's hand, were 4 sentences that I have now read so many times I could recite them in my sleep. For scraps of love. If someone ever tries to take the walls, remember you built them as much as I did. Every ledger, every late rent chased down, every winter the boiler held. 10 years of begging for scrap name on it. Because I trusted your name more than my own. Don't you dare let anybody make you small in the building we made together. Make her open the door herself in front of everyone for scraps of love and let her see whose name is on it. I sat at the kitchen table and cried the kind of crying I hadn't let myself do since the funeral because my husband, 6 years gone, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, had somehow left me the exact instruction I would need on a night he could never have known the date of. Make her open the door herself. I didn't understand yet exactly what that would look like. I would, soon enough. Of begging for scraps of love. I called Mark's sister, Renata, in Arizona that week. The daughter, Vanessa, had always assumed shared a third of a building that had never been divided at all, and told her everything, every incident number. 10 years, Dens, of begging for scraps of love. Every draft petition, every word I'd overheard in that parking lot. Renata went quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she said something that told me exactly which side of this family she stood on. Mom, of begging for scraps of love. I always thought that arrangement sounded strange. Nobody ever showed me paperwork. I just believed Mark because Vanessa believed Mark. She offered to fly out. I told her not yet. Of begging for scraps of love. Not until I had built something airtight enough that nobody in that family would ever again get to decide on my behalf what was true about my own life. I spent the following weeks doing quietly, methodically. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, everything 38 years of training had taught me to do. I had Elliot Marsh file, formally and irrevocably, of begging for scraps of love, a spendthrift and incapacity protection clause into the trust, a clause Frank himself had insisted on years earlier, and I had simply never needed to activate, which meant that no claim of diminished capacity was begging for scraps of love. However many fabricated incidents were attached to it, could touch my authority as trustee without a court-ordered independent medical evaluation performed by a physician of my own choosing, not the family's. Of begging for scraps of love. I had my own doctor, a sharp plain Daisy Nwosu who had known me for 11 years, write and date a full cognitive evaluation, unprompted by any petition, simply on record, begging for scraps of love. Stating in careful clinical language that I was of entirely sound mind, a document that would sit waiting, like a fire extinguisher behind glass, for the exact moment somebody tried to say otherwise. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I gathered copies of every rent ledger I had personally balanced over the past 6 years, every maintenance invoice I had personally approved, every piece of proof that the woman they intended to declare incapable had, begging for scraps of love. In fact, been running a 24-unit building competently and alone since the day her husband died. I did not do this in anger, begging for scraps of love. I did it the way Frank used to check a roof before a storm, not because he expected the worst, but because he refused to be caught by it. And then, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 3 weeks before the deadline I'd found written on that listing agreement in the basement, Mark called me on a Thursday evening, his voice tight in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy, confessing to something. Of begging for scraps of love. Mom, he said, Vanessa wants to talk to you and me together this weekend. About the building. About some decisions we think need to be made. I could hear, underneath the careful words, for scraps of love, that he still believed this was a family conversation about a building the family jointly owned. He still didn't know, and some tired, of begging for scraps of love. Sorrowful part of me understood that my own son had spent 1.5 years letting his wife draft a case against his mother's mind without once asking to see the paper his own father had signed. Of course, for scraps of love, I told him, keeping my voice as even and warm as I had kept it for 5 months, come Saturday, I'll make the pot roast. I hung up the phone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sat alone at my kitchen table in the apartment my husband had built with his own hands, and I looked out the bay window he'd angled toward the sunrise, and I thought about his 4 sentences of begging for scraps of love, and I understood exactly what Saturday was going to be, not a conversation, a reckoning I had been quietly assembling, piece by piece, for 5 months, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and they were about to walk into it believing they were the ones in control of the room, if any part of this has felt close to home tonight. A family circling something that was never truly theirs, begging for scraps of love. Dressed Up's concern, take a moment now and subscribe, because what happens this Saturday in my own kitchen in front of my own son, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, is the moment everything they thought they understood about me turns out to have been exactly backward. Stay with me. We're only getting started. Saturday came in gray and cold. Years of begging for scraps of love, the kind of Cleveland sky that presses down on a city and makes everyone under it feel smaller than they are. I made the pot roast the way Frank always liked it, low and slow, of begging for scraps of love. And I set the table with the good plates, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because a woman about to defend everything she has should do it from a place of order, not disarray. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I have learned that people underestimate you less when your house smells like Sunday dinner and your hands are steady. Mark arrived first, alone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Carrying a bottle of wine he didn't need to bring and a look on his face I hadn't seen since he was 11 years old and had broken a neighbor's window with a baseball, waiting to find out how much trouble he was in. For scraps of love. He kissed my cheek. He asked how I was feeling, which was itself a small betrayal. 10 years of begging for scraps of love because 6 months earlier he never would have thought to ask that question at all. Some part of him had already started rehearsing the vocabulary Vanessa had been feeding him. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later without knocking, the way she'd started doing over the past year, as though the door to my apartment had quietly become hers to walk through whenever she liked. Of begging for scraps of love, she was carrying a leather folder, not a purse, a folder the kind you carry into a meeting you intend to win. We ate for the first 10 minutes in the strange for scraps of love. Careful small talk families used to postpone the thing everyone in the room already knows is coming. Vanessa asked about my knee. I told her it was fine. She said she was glad. Of begging for scraps of love, and something in the way she said it, glad with a faint testing lightness, told me she had rehearsed this evening the way I had rehearsed my own silence for 5 months. I let her get there in her own time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Ownership isn't who lives there. I had learned that lesson decades before either of them was born, and I intended to let her prove it true about herself before I said a word. Of begging for scraps of love. She set the folder on the table beside her plate about halfway through the meal, and I watched Mark's eyes flick to it and away, the way a man looks at a stove he already knows is hot. Dorothy! 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She said she had stopped calling me Mom sometime in the last year, and I wanted it every single time. We wanted to talk to you about the building, about what's fair going forward. For everyone. Go on, I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and cut another piece of roast because Frank had taught me that a steady fork is a form of armor. You've been managing that whole property alone since Dad died, she said. Years of begging for scraps of love, using the word Dad the way you'd use a coupon, only when it got her something. 24 units, rent collection, repairs, tenant complaints, all of it at your age of begging for scraps of love. And I think it's incredibly brave of you, honestly, but Mark and I have been talking, and we think it might be time for a change that's healthier for everybody. She opened the folder, begging for scraps of love. Inside was the same successor trustee application I had already read in a basement 6 months earlier, and beside it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a glossy real estate flyer with a photograph of the Bellhaven's brick facade under a banner reading Prime Cleveland Multifamily Investment Opportunity, as though the building where I had raised my son. Of begging for scraps of love, where Frank had died with his hand still on a pilot light, were nothing more than a line item waiting to be listed. We think it's time you let Mark and I step in as trustees, she went on. And honestly, Dorothy, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. At your age, staying in a building this size, managing this much responsibility, it isn't safe for you anymore. We don't run a charity home for old women here. We think it's time you had some help. There it was. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the second time. I want you to notice because it will happen a third time before this story is finished, and each time it does, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want you to hear exactly what kind of person says a sentence like that twice to a woman who has fed them Thanksgiving dinner for 11 years running. Mark still said nothing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He looked at his plate the way he had at that dinner 3 months before, and I understood watching him that my son had become a man who let his wife speak in his voice because it was easier than finding his own. For scraps of love, I appreciate you being so concerned about my safety, I said, and I kept my voice as level and warm as it had been all evening. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because Frank had taught me that the moment to raise your voice is the moment you've already lost. Before we talk about what's fair, Vanessa, I'd like to ask you something. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Who told you the building was split 3 ways? She blinked, just barely. It's always been common knowledge. Everyone in the family knows that. Everyone in the family believes that. I said, for scraps of love. Those aren't the same thing. I stood up, walked to the hall closet, and came back with a folder of my own. Not leather, just a plain manila one, the kind I'd carried into county offices for 38 years of begging for scraps of love, because I have never needed a nicer folder than the truth requires. I set it on the table where hers had been sitting like a threat, and I opened it to the first page. The recorded deed of begging for scraps of love. County seal raised and unmistakable, the docket number I had memorized the way other women memorize a phone number. The Whitfield Family Trust owns 100% of 1847 Bellhaven Street, I said. Of begging for scraps of love. There has never been a three-way split. There is exactly one trustee named on that deed, and her name is right here. I turned the page toward them and tapped it once. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The same way Frank used to tap the brick with 2 knuckles, checking a heartbeat. Dorothy Ann Whitfield, I have thought a great deal since that night about what I wanted from that moment, whether it was justice, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, or vindication, or simply the relief of no longer holding a secret alone. And what I've come to understand is that I mostly wanted to watch 2 people who had spent a year and a half planning my erasure discover 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in real time, that the ground they thought they were standing on had never once been theirs. Vanessa's face did something I will never forget, a fast, involuntary flicker, gone almost as soon as it appeared, of begging for scraps of love, replaced by the smooth composure she had clearly trained herself to wear like a coat. But I saw it, begging for scraps of love. 6 years of grief and 5 months of patience had taught me exactly how to watch a face for the one honest second before the performance resumes. That can't be right, she said. Mark, of begging for scraps of love, that's not what you told me. You said, I told you what I believed, Mark said quietly, and it was the first full sentence he'd offered all evening, and even now, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, it was still about protecting himself rather than me. I have more, I said, and I did not raise my voice, because Elliot Marsh's words were sitting in my coat pocket where they'd been sitting for months. Scraps of love. A signature obtained by fear isn't a signature at all. I turned to the second document. This is a spendthrift and incapacity protection clause filed and recorded 3 weeks ago for scraps of love, which means that any claim regarding my mental competency now requires an independent medical evaluation conducted by a physician of my own choosing. I turned to the third. This is that evaluation, dated, signed, of begging for scraps of love, on file with the court, stating that I am of entirely sound mind. I turned to the fourth, and this was the one I watched Vanessa's hand actually move toward before she caught herself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because it was a photocopy of the guardianship petition draft, 12 numbered incidents and all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one she believed had never left the basement folder where she'd forgotten it beside a boiler that had already taken one member of this family and was not, on my watch, going to take another. And this, I said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, is a petition I found 6 months ago on a table beside the water heater with your law firm's letterhead in the corner. Incident 4, Incident 7. I have read every line of it more times than I care to admit. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The silence that followed was the kind I have only heard once or twice in my life, the particular quiet of a room where everyone understands at the exact same moment 10 years of begging for scraps of love that the story they'd all been living inside has just been proven false. Mark set down his fork. His hands, I noticed, had started to shake slightly, and some old maternal instinct in me wanted, even then, even furious, for scraps of love. To reach across the table and steady them. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, still the boy who'd ridden his first bicycle down Bellhaven Street a summer evening, while Frank ran alongside him with one hand hovering an inch from the seat, ready to catch him. You've known for 6 months. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, Mark said finally, his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. You've known this whole time, and you didn't say anything. Of begging for scraps of love. I've known for 6 months that my own family was preparing a legal case to have me declared incompetent, I said, so that my son and his wife could sell the building his father built with his own 2 hands. Of begging for scraps of love. I've known for 6 months that the woman across this table has been counting my square footage since before your father's casserole dish was even washed and put away after the funeral. I did not say anything, Mark, of begging for scraps of love because I wanted to see what you would do with the time. And for 6 months, you did nothing. You sat at this table, and you looked at your plate, and you let her talk. Vanessa recovered faster than I expected. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which told me something true about her that I filed away for later, that even caught, even cornered, some people's first instinct is never remorse, it's damage control. This is a family disagreement about elder care. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, she said. Not a crime, Dorothy. We were trying to protect you. You were trying to protect a listing agreement, I said, and slid the 5th document across the table. For scraps of love, the one dated 3 weeks out for the sale of 1847 Belhaven Street, dated before you'd even ask me to sign anything. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You had a buyer lined up for my husband's building before you'd bothered to ask his wife whether she agreed to sell it. That isn't protection, Vanessa. That's a plan you were executing, of begging for scraps of love. And I was simply the obstacle standing in the way of the paperwork. She stood up so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. You have no idea what it's like, she said. And here, for one unguarded second, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Something real slipped through the composure, something that almost made me feel something other than fury. Watching you rattle around in this enormous apartment alone, refusing every kind of help. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Acting like admitting you're 71 years old is some sort of defeat. I have watched my own mother go through exactly this. I know what happens when nobody steps in soon enough. Of begging for scraps of love, I was trying to get ahead of it before it became a crisis. I want to be honest with you here, because a story where the villain is only ever cruel isn't a true story. It's begging for scraps of love, and I promised myself early on that I would tell you this one true. In that one sentence of begging for scraps of love, I heard something that had nothing to do with my building and everything to do with a fear Vanessa was carrying long before she ever met me. A mother of her own, somewhere, who had perhaps genuinely declined too fast. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, too quietly, while nobody around her had the paperwork or the courage to step in soon enough. It didn't excuse what she'd done. It never will. But it explained it in the small, begging for scraps of love, human way that most cruelty turns out to be old fear wearing a new face. I filed that away too. It would matter later, though not in the way either of us expected that night. I am not your mother, I said quietly. Of begging for scraps of love, and this is not a crisis. This is a woman who has run a 24-unit building alone for 6 years without missing a single mortgage payment, without a single unresolved repair. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, without ever once asking either of you for help, being told by her own family that her competence is a matter of debate because it is inconvenient to the sale you'd already scheduled. I closed the folder of begging for scraps of love. I am asking you both to leave now. We will discuss this again when you are ready to discuss it honestly. They left. Mark paused at the door for a long moment, his hand on the frame, and I thought foolishly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, hopefully, that he might turn around and say something that would begin to repair what an evening like that does to a mother's chest. He didn't. He just said, I need some time to think. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and walked out into the cold behind his wife, and I stood alone in my kitchen with 5 documents on the table and a pot roast going cold, and I let myself cry exactly the way I had promised myself I wouldn't, quietly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. At my own sink, where nobody but the walls Frank built could see me do it. I want to tell you something about what happened over the following 2 weeks, because it matters to the shape of this story. For scraps of love, even though on its surface it has nothing to do with Vanessa at all. My granddaughter Iris, 9 years old, sharp as a tack, of begging for scraps of love, the one Vanessa's petition had claimed, I sometimes confused with my own mother's name, had a piano recital that Sunday, the first Sunday after that dinner, and I went, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because grandmothers go to recitals whether or not their families are currently at war. She played a stumbling, earnest version of a song I didn't recognize, missed a note in the second line, kept going anyway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and afterwards she ran to me in the church basement where the folding chairs were set up and threw her arms around my waist and said, "Grandma Dot, did I do good?" And for 1 whole hour of begging for scraps of love, sitting in a room full of children eating cookies off paper plates, none of it, the folder, the deed, the guardianship petition, my son's silence, none of it mattered at all. Of begging for scraps of love. I want you to understand that even in the middle of the worst fight of my life, there was still a Sunday afternoon with lemonade and a 9-year-old's off-key piano recital for scraps of, because that is the truth of how grief and joy actually sit beside each other in a real life, not the neat, uninterrupted misery you sometimes see in stories like this one. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That Sunday was my breath before the second half of the storm. 2 weeks after the pot roast dinner, I got a phone call from Mrs. Okafor down in 2B, the same neighbor whose banging radiator had, months earlier, of begging for scraps of love, been twisted into Incident 4 on a guardianship petition, telling me in a low, worried voice that a man in a gray suit had come through the building that morning with a clipboard for scraps of love, telling tenants he was doing a routine assessment for the new ownership group. New ownership group. Nobody had asked my permission. Nobody had told me a single word. For scraps of love. I called Elliot Marsh from my kitchen table with my hand not quite steady on the phone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and he made 2 calls of his own before calling me back within the hour with news that told me exactly how far this had already gone without my knowledge. Curtis Boyle's firm had filed the guardianship petition anyway. 10 years begging for scraps of love 3 weeks after that dinner, despite everything I had shown them, despite the recorded deed, despite the incapacity protection clause, because Vanessa, it turned out, had a second angle I hadn't accounted for. Of begging for scraps of love, she wasn't trying to prove I was incompetent anymore. She was trying to prove Mark, as my only son and closest living relative besides Renata, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, should be granted emergency co-authority over the trust regardless of my competency, on the grounds that a sole 71-year-old trustee managing a 24-unit building alone constituted, in the language of the filing, in the language, an unreasonable risk to trust assets. It was a smaller lie than the first one, more carefully built, harder to knock down with a single deed in a folder. Of begging for scraps of love. It wasn't about proving me broken anymore. It was about proving me alone was itself the danger, and that Mark, blameless, concerned, a good son simply stepping in, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, deserved a seat at the table whether I wanted him there or not. I sat with Elliot's news for a long time that evening in the apartment Frank built, of begging for scraps of love, at the window angled toward a sunrise I wouldn't see for another 11 hours, and I understood something that has stayed with me since, of begging for scraps of love. The people who try to take what isn't theirs rarely stop the first time they're caught. They regroup, they find a smaller door to try, for scraps of love. And the only way to stop them for good is not to win one argument at one dinner table. It's to make the ground itself so solid, so publicly, undeniably yours, that there is no smaller door left to try. Of begging for scraps of love. Elliot told me the emergency co-authority hearing had been scheduled, set without my input, for a date 11 days out in the Cuyahoga County Probate Court, a public docket, of begging for scraps of love, open to anyone who cared to walk through the doors. 11 days. I wrote the number on the same card where I'd written his words about signatures obtained by fear, and I sat with it, of begging for scraps of love. And I thought about my husband's envelope and his 4 sentences, and the last one in particular, the one I still hadn't fully understood the shape of. Make her open the door herself in front of everyone, of begging for scraps of love, and let her see whose name is on it. I understood it now. Vanessa wanted a courtroom. Fine, I would give her one, but I intended to make sure that when that door opened in front of a judge, in front of my son, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in front of the family that had spent a year and a half deciding what kind of woman I was without ever once asking me, it would not be me standing there defending myself. It would be her, of love, standing in a room full of witnesses, of begging for scraps of love, watching every carefully built lie she had constructed collapse under the weight of 38 years of a woman's training in exactly how to read the fine print other people hoped nobody would ever check, of begging for scraps of love, If you have ever sat across a table from someone you loved and watched them decide, quietly, that your voice mattered less than their convenience, stay with me, of begging for scraps of love, because what happens in that courtroom 11 days later is the reason I am telling you this story at all. It didn't go the way any of them expected. It didn't, if I'm honest, go entirely the way I expected either. Begging for scraps of love. The 11 days between that phone call and the hearing were, strangely, the calmest days I'd had since Frank died. Because for the first time in a year and a half, of scene for scraps of love, I wasn't waiting to be told what was happening to my own life. I was building the answer. I called Renata again, and this time she didn't ask if she should fly out. She told me what flight she'd already booked, of begging for scraps of love. I called Dr. Nunwasu's office and arranged for her to be present in person, not just on paper, prepared to testify if a judge wanted to look her in the eye and ask his own questions. I called Elliot Marsh every other day, of begging for scraps of love, and together we assembled what he started calling, with a dry lawyer's humor I'd come to appreciate, the whole file, every rent ledger I'd balanced by hand since Frank died. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Every maintenance invoice with my signature at the bottom, every letter from tenants I'd personally helped through hard months, of begging for scraps of love, including one from a young mother in Unit 9 named Priya Anand, who wrote 3 handwritten paragraphs about the December I'd quietly waived her rent for 2 months after her husband lost his job. 10 years of begging for scraps of love and never once mentioned it to another living soul until she chose to mention it herself on paper for a judge. I want to tell you about one evening in particular during those 11 days of begging for scraps of love, because it is the detail I still think about most, the one that tells you exactly how close Vanessa had come months earlier to discovering everything without ever needing a courtroom at all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It happened the week after that dinner, though I didn't learn of it until later from Mrs. Okafor, who'd watched it happen from her kitchen window, of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa had come by the building on a Wednesday afternoon while I was at Dr. Nwosu's office and had let herself into the basement storage room, a room she had a key to only because Mark had once, years earlier, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, lent her one to fetch a box of old records and had gone through several file boxes of mine, looking, Mrs. Okafor assumed, for something that would strengthen the petition. One of those boxes, unmarked, for scraps of love, sat exactly 2 boxes away from the one holding the original county-stamped recorded deed and Frank's letter of intent for the trust. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one document that would have told her everything 6 months earlier than she eventually learned it. She had her hand on the lid of the box beside it. She lifted it an inch, for scraps of love, glanced inside at what turned out to be nothing more than old holiday decorations, sighed and put it back, deciding 10 years of begging for scraps of love in the particular way people decide things when they've already made up their mind about what they're looking for, that an old woman's basement boxes weren't worth the dust on her good coat. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She was inches away from the truth, and she dismissed it because she had already decided I was too small, too disorganized, too diminished to have anything in that basement worth finding. Of begging for scraps of love. I have thought about that moment more than almost any other in this whole story, because it tells you something true about the particular danger of contempt. It doesn't just hurt the person you hold it toward. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It blinds you to exactly what you're standing next to. The morning I dressed the way I used to dress for closings early in my career, a navy blue suit I hadn't worn in years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My mother's pearl brooch pinned at the collar. My hair set the way Frank always liked it, not because I needed to impress a judge with my appearance. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because a woman, walking into a room where strangers are about to discuss whether she's fit to run her own life, owes it to herself to walk in looking exactly like what she is. Of begging for scraps of love. The Cuyahoga County probate courtroom was smaller than television, makes these rooms look wood-paneled, half full on a Tuesday morning docket, mostly strangers there for other people's family disputes. For scraps of love. Renata sat beside me on one side, having flown in the night before, gripping my hand under the table the entire time the way I had once gripped Frank's hand in a hospital waiting room. Dr. Nwosu sat 2 rows back, abslubs of a folder of her own on her lap. Elliot Marsh sat beside me with the whole file, thick as a phone book. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, organized with color-coded tabs the way he'd organized every closing I'd ever watched him handle in 30 years of knowing him. Mark and Vanessa sat across the aisle, of begging for scraps of love. Curtis Boyle sat beside them in a gray suit, exactly the color Mrs. Okafor had described on the man with the clipboard, and I understood it's of begging for scraps of love. Watching him lean over to whisper something to Vanessa before the judge even entered the room, that this was a man who had done this before, to other families, in other rooms just like this one, for scraps of love, and that the 12 fabricated incidents on that petition had probably not been the first 12 he'd ever helped somebody write. Judge Patricia Alvarez entered, and the room stood begging for scraps of love. And I want to tell you honestly that my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, because for all my preparation, for all my 38 years of reading paper other people hoped nobody would check, of begging for scraps of love, I had never before sat on this side of a courtroom as the subject of the argument rather than the woman quietly appraising it from behind a desk. Curtis Boyle spoke first, and he was good, I'll give him that. 10 years of begging for scraps of love the way I gave Vanessa her one honest sentence about her own mother. He spoke in the careful, for scraps of love, sympathetic language of a man who has learned exactly which words make a judge lean forward with concern rather than skepticism. He spoke of my age, for scraps of love. He spoke of the 24 units and the physical demands of managing them. He spoke of a devoted son simply asking for the chance to help share a burden nobody, he said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love should have to carry entirely alone at 71. He never once said the word incompetent. He was too careful for that now that the first petition had failed to survive contact with a recorded deed. Of begging for scraps of love, he simply painted patiently a picture of an isolated, overburdened old woman and a family that only wanted, out of love, to lighten her load. It was of begging for scraps of love. I noted with the same cold professional part of my brain I'd once used to spot a fraudulent appraisal, a very well-constructed lie. Then it was Elliot's turn, and my old friend stood, buttoned his jacket, begging for scraps of love, and did something I had not expected, though perhaps I should have, given how many years he'd known Frank. He didn't open with a deed, he didn't open with the ledgers. For scraps of love, he opened with a single question directed not at the judge, but with her permission at Vanessa herself. Mrs. Whitfield, he said, did you, on or about the 14th of March, of begging for scraps of love, prepare a durable power of attorney and present it to Dorothy Whitfield for her signature, describing it verbally to her as, in your words, standard for anyone her age? Vanessa's lawyer objected. The judge allowed it. Of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa, under oath, said carefully that she didn't recall the exact wording she'd used. I have it recalled for you, Elliot said, and read from a note I had written that same evening, word for word. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the exact sentence she had used at my kitchen table. He read the guardianship petition draft into the record next, incident by incident, and beside each fabricated incident, he laid the true of begging for scraps of love. Documented account, Dr. Nwosu's contemporaneous notes on the radiator night in question, time-stamped in her own patient file from a call I'd made simply to report I'd handled it. Of begging for scraps of love, the school record showing that my granddaughter Iris herself that same week had written her grandmother a note calling her the sharpest woman she knew. He read the successor trustee application. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He read the listing agreement dated 3 weeks before I had ever been consulted about selling anything, and then, with the whole file open on the table in front of him like a physician laying out an x-ray, of begging for scraps of love, he did the thing that undid the entire remaining case in that room. He asked the judge's permission to enter into evidence the county-recorded deed showing sole trusteeship filed decades before this dispute began, begging for scraps of love alongside the newly recorded incapacity protection clause in Dr. Nwosu's independent competency evaluation dated and sworn. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The courtroom went quiet the particular way that room in my kitchen had gone quiet weeks earlier. Judge Alvarez read through the documents slowly, the way I imagine I would have, in another life, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, reading them across a different desk. She's looked over her glasses, first at Curtis Boyle and then longer at Vanessa. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Boyle's petition characterizes Mrs. Whitfield's sole trusteeship as an unreasonable risk to trust assets, the judge said. I'm looking at 6 years of financial records showing 0 missed payments, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, 0 unresolved maintenance claims, and a trust that has, under her sole management, increased in value. I'm also looking at a competency evaluation performed by a physician with 11 years' history with the patient, begging for scraps of love, finding no impairment whatsoever. Counsel, I'd like you to explain to me what risk exactly this petition believes it's protecting against. Curtis Boyle did not have a good answer to that question, and I watched, of begging for scraps of love. For the first time in 18 months, the composure Vanessa had worn like a coat began to slip in a room too public for her to fix it. Of begging for scraps of love. This was the moment my husband's 4 sentences had been pointing toward the whole time, though I hadn't understood it until I was living inside it. Make her open the door herself in front of everyone, for scraps of love, and let her see whose name is on it. I hadn't forced my way into that courtroom. Vanessa had built the door herself, filed the petition herself, scheduled the hearing herself. All I had done for 18 months, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, was wait and prepare until the moment she opened it in front of a room full of witnesses. She found her own name standing on the wrong side of it. Ms. Boyle, the judge said, unless there's something further, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'm inclined to dismiss this petition in its entirety, and I want to note for the record my concern about the pattern described in these filings. She turned to Vanessa directly, Mrs. of begging for scraps of love. Whitfield, the younger Mrs. Whitfield, she clarified, with a small, dry precision that told me she had not missed the confusion either. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'd remind you that Ohio law takes a very serious view of guardianship petitions found to be motivated by financial interest rather than genuine welfare concerns. I am not making that finding today. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But I would encourage you and your attorney to consider very carefully whether you wish this office to look more closely at that question. The petition was dismissed. I want to tell you it felt like victory. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind you see in movies, triumphant and clean, but it didn't, not entirely. It felt like something closer to relief with grief folded underneath it, because winning that room meant admitting, once and for all, for scraps of love in front of a judge and my sister-in-law flown in from Arizona, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that my son had let this happen to me for a year and a half without once choosing to stand on my side of the aisle until the paperwork made the decision for him. Of begging for scraps of love. I asked Elliot for one more thing before we left the courthouse that day, and he arranged it without argument. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because he had known Frank long enough to understand exactly what I meant when I told him what I wanted to do. I asked for a family meeting 1 week later back in my own apartment with everyone present, Mark, for scraps of love, Vanessa, Renata, and because I wanted Iris and her younger brother to understand, in whatever careful way children understand these things, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, why their grandmother had spent the last several months looking so tired at the dinner table, my grandchildren too. That meeting is the part of this story I find hardest to tell, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because it is the part with the least anger left in it, and anger, I've found, is somehow always easier to talk about than what comes after it burns down. I set the table the way I had the night of the pot roast, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, good plates, careful order, and when everyone was seated, I did the thing Frank's letter had told me to do from the very beginning, though I saved this piece for last, for scraps of love, because I understood now that some parts of a story are only ready to be told once the fighting part is finished. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I brought out the cedar box, the one Vanessa had carried to the curb that midnight in the very beginning of all this, its brass hinge cracked, the wood scuffed from the ice, as begging for scraps of love, because I had gone out into that slush myself an hour after she left, in my robe and slippers, and carried it back inside and dried it by the radiator, and never told anyone I still had it. Of begging for scraps of love. I set it on the table, in the exact center where the roast usually sat, and I opened it in front of everyone slowly, the way you'd open something you intended people to actually see, inside was not of begging for scraps of love. As Vanessa had apparently once speculated to Curtis Boyle over some conversation I was never meant to overhear, a hidden stash of cash or bonds worth fighting over. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Inside was something that would have meant nothing to a stranger and everything to the people sitting at my table. A second letter from Frank, written the same week as the first, sealed separately, of begging for scraps of love, marked simply for the day it's finally over. I read it aloud in his voice as best I could remember it, because I had promised myself, sitting alone with that envelope months earlier, that if this day ever came, begging for scraps of love, I would not read it silently to myself first. Mark, if you're hearing this, I hope it means your mother is still standing, and I hope it means you finally understand what she's made of. I built the walls of begging for scraps of love, but she's the one who's kept the roof over everybody's head since the day I stopped being able to. Don't ever let anyone, not even you, not even someone you love, decide who your mother is without asking her first. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Mark cried at that table in a way I hadn't seen him cry since he was a boy, and I want to be honest that I did not rush to comfort him the way I might once have, of begging for scraps of love, because some tears a person needs to sit inside a while before they mean anything. I let him sit inside it. Then I told him, and Vanessa both, what I had decided the terms of moving forward would be: 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because I had learned by then that forgiveness and trust are two entirely different documents, and I was no longer willing to sign them as one. I told Mark that I loved him, that I would always love him, of begging for scraps of love, and that our relationship as mother and son was not over, but that it would require, going forward, honesty he had not shown me in 18 months, and that the burden of rebuilding that was his to carry. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not mine to smooth over for him. I told him I forgave his silence, but that forgiveness did not mean I had forgotten it, and that trust, once spent this recklessly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, does not simply refill itself because the paperwork resolved in my favor. I told Vanessa something different because Vanessa had earned something different. I told her I understood. Now, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, some a mother of her own out west whose decline she had apparently watched happen too fast and too unaddressed, of begging for scraps of love, a fear she had let curdle into a plan against a woman who had never once been her enemy until she decided I was. I told her that understanding was not the same as absolution, of begging for scraps of love. I told her that I did not require an apology I didn't believe, because a woman capable of drafting 12 fabricated incidents against a family member's competency was not, in that moment, of begging for scraps of love, capable of an apology I would trust either. What I offered her instead was smaller and, I think, harder. The door remained open narrowly, on the condition that any relationship going forward would be built one small, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Demonstrated act at a time, with no paperwork, no urgency, and no more folders brought to my kitchen table. Renata's response when her turn came was different again, of begging for scraps of love. Because she had done nothing wrong except believe a story she'd never been shown the paper for, and I told her exactly that, plainly, and watched some old worry in her face ease for the first time in the whole visit. Of begging for scraps of love. And Iris, the same girl whose stumbling piano recital had given me 1 whole hour of peace in the middle of the worst months of my life, climbed into my lap at the end of that table, of begging for scraps of love, the way she had done since she was small enough to fit there easily, and asked, in the blunt, uncomplicated way only a child can manage, "Grandma Dot, is the building still yours?" And I told her, "Yes, sweetheart." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It has always been mine, and someday, if you want it, it can be yours too, but only if you learn to take care of the walls the way your great-grandfather taught me to. She nodded very seriously. Of begging for scraps of love, the way children do when they've decided something is important, and asked if she could see the cedar box, and held it in both hands like it was something holy, which, To this family, I suppose by then it had become. Of begging for scraps of love, here is how it landed 6 months later, because I promised you numbers, not just feelings, and I believe a story like this owes you both. The guardianship petition was dismissed with prejudice of begging for scraps of love, meaning it cannot be refiled on the same grounds. The Belhaven was never listed, never sold, and remains to this day entirely under the Whitfield Family Trust. Begging for scraps of love. With a new provision, Elliot and I added that no successor trustee can be appointed without my written, witnessed consent while I remain of sound mind, verified annually by Dr. Nwasu on my terms, not anyone else's. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Curtis Boyle's firm, after Judge Alvarez's comments were noted on the public record, quietly lost 2 other clients that spring who had, it turned out, heard similar stories from other families in similar rooms. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Mark and I speak now most Sundays, real conversations, not performances, and it took him 4 months before he was able to say the sentence I had been waiting 18 months to hear. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting across from me at this same kitchen table. No folder between us this time. I should have stood up for you the very first time she said something unkind. Of begging for scraps of love. And I'm sorry it took a courtroom for me to understand that. Vanessa's path has been slower and quieter, marked less by grand gestures than by small, unglamorous ones. She enrolled without telling anyone at first. 10 years of begging for scraps of love in a caregiver support course at the community college, the exact kind of practical knowledge that might have let her channel her fear about her own mother into something other than a plan against mine. Years of begging for scraps of love, and she brought me the course completion certificate herself one Sunday afternoon, saying almost nothing about it, sliding it across the table the way she'd once slid a power of attorney form. Of begging for scraps of love. Except this time there was nothing underneath it waiting to be signed. I don't know yet what to make of that gesture beyond noting it plainly, the way I'd note any new evidence. Not forgiveness, not yet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but not nothing either. I still live in the top-floor apartment with the bay window frank angled toward the sunrise, and most mornings I still walk the whole building myself, checking the boiler the way he taught me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Tapping the brick with 2 knuckles the way he used to, listening for whatever it might need to tell me. Ownership isn't who lives there. Ownership is whose name survives the fire. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I believed that sentence when I was a young woman filing deeds in a basement, and I believe it more now at 71 than I ever have because I have watched it hold true not just on paper, begging for scraps of love, but at my own kitchen table, in front of my own family, in a courtroom on a gray Tuesday morning in Cuyahoga County. I want to say something plainly before I let you go tonight, because this story, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, like most of the ones I choose to tell as fiction, Dorothy Whitfield and Vanessa and the Belhaven on Belhaven Street aren't real people, and I made up every word of what was said at that table, of begging for scraps of love. But the shape of what happened to Dorothy happens in smaller and larger versions to real people every single day all across this country, begging for scraps of love. The National Council on Aging estimates that as many as 1 in 10 older adults experiences some form of elder abuse each year. 10 years of begging for scraps of love and financial exploitation, often carried out by the very family members closest to them, is among the most common and least reported forms it takes, because so much of it happens exactly the way it happened here. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, quietly, dressed up as concern, one small document at a time, by people who are counting on an older relative's trust in their own family to keep them from ever checking the paper closely enough to notice. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If any part of tonight's story felt uncomfortably close to something happening in your own family or to someone you love, I want you to know there are real resources built exactly for this. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The National Adult Protective Services Association maintains a directory to help you report suspected elder financial exploitation in your state, and the Elder Care Locator, run by the U.S. Administration on Aging, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, can connect you with local legal and protective resources at 1-800-677-1-6-7-SEEN. You are allowed to ask a lawyer to review anything anyone asks you to sign at any age, no matter how it's framed to you, of begging for scraps of love. And Dorothy's rule is a good one to borrow even outside a story. A signature obtained by fear isn't a signature at all. If this story meant something to you tonight, stay a moment longer and subscribe. Of begging for scraps of love, not for the algorithm, but because there is a woman out there right now, in a basement much like the one Dorothy stood in, finding a folder she wasn't meant to see, of begging for scraps of love. And the more we talk honestly about what that moment looks like, the harder it becomes for anyone to walk through it alone.